always going to be more of it. Okay, we are up and running. Good afternoon to everyone. Hope everyone is doing well, and hope you all brought an umbrella or something else to run back to your cars. But in Judaism, remember, we say blessings over rains. We don't curse it. So we'll try to keep some perspective. It is good and useful. We're supposed to say blessing when we do our morning blessings, our morning prayers, and the blessing for La'asok b'divrei Torah, for doing the study of Torah, is covers the entire day. So it's a blessing that is good from when you say it in the morning until when you go to sleep at night. You don't have to keep saying it before each study time. Okay, but as we continue in Moses' summation of everything that came before him, we are about to we're in the Parashat Vaetchanan, which contains a lot of really famous stuff. We were chatting a little bit about the Ten Commandments before we got started. We are not going to be looking at the Ten Commandments this year. In this class, obviously, please do read the rest of it. And the comparison between this version and the one in Exodus is quite fascinating. But instead, we're going to look at what is probably even more famous than the Ten Commandments. And John?
The Shema.
The Shema. Right? Everybody knows the Shema. I don't care whether you are, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Conservative, Reform, Renewal, Humanist, Jewish. Everybody learns the Shema at some point. Right? Shema Yisrael. Right? Hear, O Israel, is the way we've all learned it, because O, of course, is a Hebrew word. It is, but it's not meaning O. That's like one of the few places where people will still insist on writing O in the middle of an English sentence. And we've modernized so many other translations, but when people will recite the Shema in English, they will still cling to the older version of Hear, O Israel, because that is how it has been engraved in us since time immemorial, since English was written down, King James Bible being the most important marker for that English translation. But something comes right after the Shema, which is almost as famous, although much harder to say clearly, and is the bane of many of our youngest students when they're still learning their Hebrew, which is Ve'ahavta. Right? The Ve'ahavta comes right after the Shema, and that paragraph is a little bit harder to pronounce. And has a great deal of content, however. So we're going to be looking at this passage, and then we're going to delve into one part of the Ve'ahavta in particular as we go forward. So we are on chapter 6 of the book of Deuteronomy, which is on page 10,023. Did I say 10,000? 1,023. It's not quite that thick a book. 1,023. Or you can just look for chapter 6. What's that? Well, we're starting with the beginning of chapter 6, right? Because everything has context, and it's rather important sometimes to remember the context when trying to understand what it is that you're focusing on. Now, as our usual volunteer for reading is up at a conference, looking for a new volunteer. I see a hand.
And this is the instruction, the laws and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded me to impart to you, to be observed in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you, your children, and your children's children may revere the Lord your God and follow, as long as you live, all his laws and commandments that I enjoin upon you, to the end that you may long endure.
All right. Really, really long when written out in this particular way of translating it. But what is the gist of what God is telling Moses to share with the people that we are doing here? What's the gist of that? This is maybe a little bit clunky in English grammar, but he's making a very straightforward thesis statement.
Here's the instruction, the laws, and the rules.
Okay. So instructions. And what are we supposed to do about the instructions? We're supposed to follow.
Observe.
right? And then there's a number of synonyms for the observation, right? For following, for observing, to obey, and such. And why are we doing this?
To keep God in awe,
Mm-hmm.
number one, and number two, so that your days may be long, or so that you may long endure.
All right, so we've got these instructions, which we are meant to follow, and which we are meant to mean we revere God, and so that we will endure long in the land. And so these seem to be the different things that are being called for here. And I should also just remind you that he's pointing it out that this is a multi-generational call. Right? He's not saying this is just about you. It's about you and your kids and your grandkids. This is something that is meant to be enduring, not just about a personal, private, little spiritual experience. This is something that is meant to create a totality that is greater than any one individual, but which is built upon the actions of each individual. Right? This is the great balance within Judaism of community versus individual. Right? The community is built upon individuals. The individuals are tasked with building an enduring life that will create a community of Torah. That both parts are essential. You can't have one without the other.
Is the endurance a reward for following and revering God? Or is it, as you just stated, another aspect of reverence?
So is this a reward? Is this an aspect? Or, I'm going to throw in one more, is this a result? Is this just a consequence? Right? Is it a result that happens automatically just because if you don't, of course you're not going to, which isn't the same as a reward, since reward would imply that there would be a punishment if you didn't. Or is this just part of what it means to revere, right? I mean, if you revere, this is just what goes along with it.
But the way
Please.
I learned it, if you follow the laws, you are then, by definition, in reverence of awe of God by following His laws. And if you are, then the reward for that is long endurance in the land.
So what you're saying is that reverence is a result of obedience?
Yeah.
And then the result of reverence is endurance.
Yes.
Got it. So that obedience comes first, second, third in order, rather than as three separate ideas, right? And this is what we're going to try and figure out: is what is the causality here? What is the result of agency to effect? How is this all fitting together so that we understand what's happening when we are following the commandments, when we are giving reverence to God, or when we're enduring? What does our endurance tell us about this relationship, or does it tell us anything? So this simple set of seemingly preamble text is actually laying out a very complicated, because we haven't figured it out completely yet, set of ideas. And that's what I want you to get your attention around. All right, verse 3, let's move on. We need more
Obey,
text.
O Israel, willingly and faithfully, that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, spoke to you. Hear, O Israel.
Wait, hold on. Right, so did we add anything? Did we change anything? All right, we definitely got more of this.
So that you multiply, increase greatly.
So the obedience, the obey, seems to be resulting in not only endurance, but also in goodness, right? In plenty. That'll be good for you, right? Flowing of milk and honey, the universal symbols in the Torah of abundance.
But the obedience needs to be willing and faithful.
But willing, yeah, faithful.
It compels somebody to do something, but that doesn't mean that they're in reverence.
Is that talking then about our reverence issue, right? Is being willing and faithful then what leads to obedience, and then what leads to plenty? Well, doesn't that mean then that we should swap these two? Aren't we saying then that reverence comes first before obedience?
No, but
It ought to.
Well, I mean, so psychologically, in the modern world, especially as wonderful free Americans, we believe that our own inspiration should lead to obedience, never obedience lead to inspiration. Doing it the other way around sounds like brainwashing.
They're behavioral psychologists, and then
But if you're a behavioral psychologist, or indeed anybody who has studied human nature, you'll know that for most people, doing comes before understanding. And certainly that is the way we all grow as children, and it's the way most of us behave in the rest of our life. We do things, and then we either rationalize it or understand it and take more control of it and modify it and move on. That's how we engage with much of what's going on in our life, is we sort of just do and then figure it out as we have done.
I think maybe that arrow coming from willing and faithful needs to go to obey rather than revere.
Well, I was saying that willing and faithful was a synonym for revering God.
It's an aspect of obedience.
Okay, so is it an aspect that comes from obedience, or is it an aspect that leads to obedience?
No, it goes with. You can obey,
Right.
but
Right.
you can obey as if you were compelled to obey, or you can obey willingly and faithfully.
Right, which we all probably have examples in our own life of times we've gone along with something our boss said or someone else said because we had to. We absolutely disagreed with it, and we respected them less because they were making us do this, but we did it anyway because that was what our job was. That would definitely not be called willing or faithful, and certainly we would not be having any reverence for that person after the fact. On the other hand, there are probably people who we are willing and faithfully willing to go along, but we may not revere them either. Right? All of these components are in fact interconnected, but separate and distinct. Right? Our enthusiasm, our willingness, our faithfulness is different than our reverence. And there are people who joyfully will engage in the mitzvot, will joyfully engage in a Jewish life, who nevertheless will never materialize a deep respect for God. And there are people who will have a deep respect for God, who nevertheless begrudge having to obey the commandments. And there are people who have deep respect for God and will willingly and faithfully do the commandments, but not so often. They will not actually do them routinely. The whole follow-through element doesn't always kick in. And then that leaves us still wondering, what's this whole endurance? And how do we make this whole system work? Well, do I have a system for you? How can we make this work? It's almost as though what comes next is meant to reinforce and untangle some of this, because, context.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone.
Oh, wait, the Lord alone? All right, so most of us were probably raised with the translation, the Lord is one, which is, Adonai Echad at the end. Now, the great thing about Hebrew is that it doesn't have that wonderful present tense verb to be. So you can't say, God is something. That is drops out. Right? If I wanted to say that I was small, right, I'd say ani katan. Right? I wouldn't have any verb between me and the adjective. It's not there. But that also means that is one standing in as an actual number. That is the definition of God. God is one, like God is oneness. Or is this describing God's singular nature in the sense that there is no other God that would be worshipped, right? Only God, right? Adonai Echad, right? There's no number two, which, as you're familiar, I'm sure, with Jewish liturgy, is a common refrain, right? God is there and there is no second. So this could be another interpretation, both of which, of course, are true, but it's a different way of emphasizing something.
Fox's footnote is, despite the centrality of this phrase as a rallying cry in later Jewish history and thought, its precise meaning is not clear.
Okay, good.
Rashi says it's not clear.
No, that was
Fox.
Everett Fox. No, but our commentators over the last 2,000 years have argued over exactly what that final Adonai Echad phrase truly means. Right? The Shema, everyone understands, means listen up and do it. Right? The best English translation is not hear, but hearken. Because Shema in Hebrew is both the imperative form to listen, right, to actually use your ears, but it also has the same connotation as the word hearken in English, which means do what you have heard. Right? Don't listen and then forget it. Listen and lead to action. but a lot of people don't. So that's why listening is a little rough in English.
Just to split the hair a little finer.
Please, that's what we're here for.
The Lord alone means you should worship only God.
Exactly. So that comes, the commentators who favor the alone translation or interpretation say that fits in very well with Adonai Eloheinu, right? Adonai, which is God's proper name. It's like, I like to say, it's what God would sign for his checks. It's his name rather than title. God, the Lord, Adonai, is God, our God, and only Adonai is our God, meaning it's an exclusive relationship, well, at least in our direction to God. God is able to be obviously with the rest of the universe, but for us, we only have this relationship with God and not with Zeus and not with Baal and not with Marduk or any of the other gods of the ancient world. So yes, that is a supporting argument for saying it is only God that we are going to worship. Of course, the Echad comes back philosophically and says we are worshiping just this God because that is what it is to be God, right? To be God is to be uniquely singular, and the idea of polytheism at all is completely illogical and impossible. So obviously the result would be, of course, we would only worship God, but it's deeper on a philosophical level. But I want to take a look at the next lines. The Ve'ahavta, which everybody remembers so clearly from being drilled on it in Hebrew school, but may not ever remember what it actually means.
You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might.
All right, so before we continue with that, which part of our preamble does that seem to be addressing?
The reverence.
Okay, so love could be targeting the reverence, right? Because after all, if I love God with all my heart, with all my being, with all my soul, with all my bits, right, then that could lead to reverence. On the other hand, right, the love could just as easily be said to be referring to our willingly and faithful clause. Because after all, reverence in the Torah is not the purely positive emotion. Reverence is something that comes with some trepidation. Right? If you love your spouse, hopefully you're not also in awe of them, at least not all the time, because that makes the relationship a little uneven. And reverence is definitely an uneven feeling here. However, love could lead to a willing and faithful carrying out of your part of that relationship. So it goes in both directions for what we've done so far. All right, let's keep going.
Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you this day, and press them upon your children.
Okay, pause real quick. So now we've got taking to heart and teaching. Where's that fit into our rubric, our preamble?
First one, the instruction.
Okay, right. So the instructions, right? So take and teach are talking about the instructions in general in order that we will then follow them, right? When we take something to heart in Judaism, it doesn't just mean like we've studied it really hard. It means we have added it as part of our life. And so if you take to heart a particular commandment, then you're doing the commandment. You haven't just studied it in an academic sense. You've studied it as a personal adaptation of behavior. So take to heart definitely has the implication of not only knowing the instructions, but of also following them. And of course, by teaching, what are we now aiming at? Endurance, right? The idea that if you don't teach them, then that next and next and next generations certainly won't be around because they won't know how to live a good life. Weiter.
Impress them upon your children. Recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates.
Okay.
When the Lord...
Okay, so that's the end of the Ve'ahavta. So what are these last couple sentences talking to us about? Reciting them, binding them, inscribing them. What's that? They're talking about the instructions, right? But what are these three different commandments, sub-commandments doing in this Vaetchanan paragraph?
So that you remember and don't forget. It's part of putting them upon your heart. That way they'll always be internalized.
Right. There seems to be some idea here that we need reminders, that we need a constant reinforcement of everything else that's going on here. That just left to our own, we might have love, we might have reverence, we might have, the willingness to follow and be faithful, but day in, day out, it's hard to make all of that work if you're not getting tangible reminders. And this talks about three specific tangible reminders. One of them is the reciting of the Shema and Vaetchanan in the evening and in the morning, which is why we say the Vaetchanan and Shema as part of our morning and evening services, and even at bedtime for when we literally lay down. It's also why we do the mitzvah of, what else is this, binding on my arm and head? Tefillin, right? When we wrap tefillin on our arm and upon our head, we are taking care of that middle one. And then this inscribing them on the doorposts, the mezuzot, right?
I think, for me, one of the fascinating things with the mezuzot is you're not limited to your house. The way you live in your house should be the way you live outside your house. So it's drawing together this life is not just for you and your family here. It's how you relate to the rest of the world around you.
That it's something to do with the portal between the private and public.
Right.
That it should be marked with this idea.
But to remember who you are.
Well, to remember who you are and remember what you're doing.
Yes, well, that's who you are.
Well, exactly. All right, so,
I'm sorry.
okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's the key issue, is everything's about doing. It's all very literal.
Mm-hmm.
Observance seems like a passive kind of thing, but observance means doing something.
Right.
Yes. The English word observe literally means, in other contexts, to stand back and watch.
But we're not about watching.
Right? I observed the accident. Look, two cars hit each other. Right? That's not like the same as observing kashrut. Right? Oh, look, he's not eating bacon. That's not what we mean when we observe. You're right. Observance in English is very passive. Whereas in Hebrew, the word that's often used for observance is usually more shmirah, which is guarding, right? Being watchful about, being careful of. And so that is a much more active verb. Now we're going to look at mezuzah because there's a lot of confusion about the mezuzah, especially in the modern world. It seems to have lost some of its understanding. We've just done some context about this mitzvah of mezuzah. Tell me whether this first text, which was written after the Entebbe terrorist attack, everyone's familiar with the raid on Entebbe, yeah. Right? The plane was hijacked, taken to Uganda. Israel sent commandos in and were able to extract the hostages as well as the crew, except for a few unfortunate casualties. It was a very daring and amazing attempt to rescue people who have been taken hostage. Okay, so this was written shortly after that attack and the rescue.
A kosher mezuzah on your doorpost not only makes your house an abode for godliness, but is also your security measure, even after you have left home for the day.
All right, so the basic principle seems to be that this author is advancing, is that when you have a mezuzah on your house, that as you step out of the door, it's almost like it's spraying you with a, what's that? With protection, exactly, a special shield. It's like when your car comes out of the car wash and they spray that wax coat on it, right? It's the sealant, right? So that you're going to be Teflon for the day, that the mezuzah is sitting there spritzing protection as you leave. Onward.
And since all Jews are one large body, it increases the security of the entire Jewish nation.
Right? Every kosher mezuzah you've got is giving protection to everyone, is the idea here. It's one giant dome radiating out.
Due to the fact that most of the mezuzot in the homes of the hostages, upon examination, were found to be defective, improperly placed, or not on every doorpost, all Jews should check their mezuzot immediately.
Okay, so some of you seem to have difficulty with this phrase, but isn't it the logical conclusion? If you start with A, don't you end up at C? Right? If A is the mezuzah provides protection, and B is some of the mezuzahs of the people who were victims of Entebbe were incorrect, then C follows that they did not receive protection because their mezuzah was faulty. Makes sense, right?
There is a logic there.
There is a logic there. So, but where? Because I'll tell you, I disagree vehemently with the conclusion. Where then do we have to adjust the formula to make sure that that conclusion is not the conclusion we reach?
The mezuzah is
It's
not
not
a
a
magical amulet.
It's not
Okay.
a security measure.
So the idea that the mezuzah would be a security, that it would be spraying protection upon you, would be the easiest place to fix, right? To say that no, it's not going, psh, 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 now I'm Teflon and bullets are going to fly off me, right? And I don't have to worry about being hijacked because I passed through a portal with a kosher mezuzah. That seems to be the easiest point of attack. And we might be thinking, well, this is a modern publication. Maybe older sources don't treat the mezuzah the same way.
Passover, the blood on the lintel,
Mhm.
Egypt, I mean, it's the same logic.
We'll get there. We'll get there. Read text 2.
When Rabbi was sent a precious jewel by a foreign king, Artavan, he sent back a mezuzah. When the king responded that his gift was worth far less than the jewel,
Okay, come on.
Rabbi answered thus: neither the things you nor I might desire, material wealth, are comparable to it. And furthermore, what you have sent me requires my protection, whereas what I have sent you protects you even while you sleep. When you walk, it will lead you. When you lie down, it will watch over you. Proverbs.
Right. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, taken from Yerushalmi and the Jerusalem Talmud, is saying, look, you sent me a jewel. Now I've got to be careful it doesn't get stolen. But I sent you a mezuzah, which means now God is looking after you. Right? So you sent me something that I have to look after. I sent you something that will look after you. And yes, materially, we obviously all want jewels, but let's be honest, would you rather have jewels or would you rather be safe? We all start with a need for safety, a need for our basic well-being, and then we can pile on jewels. And that's sort of, it seems, what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is saying. So isn't he agreeing then that the mezuzah is a protective amulet? And therefore, if you have a faulty one, don't be surprised that something gets through your armor. Maybe?
That's what he's saying.
Well, so the question is, how does this protectiveness work? Right? Is it the sealant coat when you're leaving the car wash? Or is there something else that's meant by protection that's being described here? Right? When we talk about God leading us and God watching over us, are we talking about what we think of as protection? Are we talking about a bulletproof shield? Are we talking about Teflon? Are we talking about something that is giving us a physical barrier to the ills of the world? Is that really what Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was discussing? Know, for example, that he did suffer greatly, especially at the end of his life.
Protect us from forgetting.
Protection from forgetting. All right. So that is going to be sort of our hinge that we're going to have to try and revolve our understanding. So hold on to that phrase. First, we're going to answer your question about the blood on the doorpost, which was during the Exodus from Egypt.
And the blood shall be for you as a sign, Exodus 12:13. As a sign for you, not as a sign for me.
All right. So when God was doing the Exodus, he asked us to slaughter the lamb and use that as our Passover meal and to put blood from it on the doorposts of the house. Specifically, says the Mechilta, if you read the text carefully, It wasn't a sign for God. It wasn't like God needed to know not here, not here, not here, yes, there, by looking at the blood. It was for us a symbol, right? The symbol of the blood wasn't to guide God.
Right.
The symbol of the blood was to do something for us, right? It was a symbol, a sign for us, an oath. So that is our linchpin. If it's not for God, because like what? God needs blood on the door to know who to and who not to. What's that? He needs a reminder, right? God for God. Wait, are you Jewish? I can't remember. Right? It kind of makes a mockery of the idea of God being omniscient, of all-knowing. All right, so now let's try and pull this apart. Again, going back to the Talmud, this time the Bavli, and get some other texts that will help us see both the protection, but how this protection happens. Onward.
Said Rabbi, the religious duty is to place it in the handbreadth nearest to the street. What is the operative consideration here? The rabbis say, so that one will meet a mitzvah as soon as one returns home. Rav Hanina of Sura says, so that it will afford protection to the whole of the house.
All right, let's just make sure we understand the difference of these two authorities. And you'll notice we have all of the rabbis on one side, and we have Rav Hanina of Sura on the other side. It's never good to be in that much of a minority. But what the argument is, and is anyone going to copy this down? The argument here is that if I have my door frame, and if my door frame is built like an ancient door frame, which means it is thick, not just a few inches like that one, then where do I put the mezuzah? I should have drawn it the other way because it's on the right-hand side. You just have to imagine we're looking through the wall. Can I put the mezuzah here, which is closest to the inside of my house? Or do I need to put the mezuzah here, which is closer to the outside of the house? And the argument of the everybody agrees is that it should be on the outside of the house. Now, the rabbis say that that's so that when you are coming home, you're going to be hitting that mitzvah, bam, just as you come in. Right? There's like no delay. You don't have to walk through all these extra steps before you get to the mitzvah mezuzah. You get the mezuzah immediately. Rav Hanina, on the other hand, says no. It's because if you put the mezuzah here, then the shield of protection would only be there. This whole zone would be unprotected. Right? You put the shield in front of your body, not behind your body. So you need to make sure you're covering everything. Everyone see what the disagreement of interpretations over? All right, onward.
Said Rabbi Hanina ben Hama.
A different Rav Hanina.
Different, yeah. Come and take note that the trait of the Holy One, blessed be He, is not the same as the trait of a mortal. The mortal trait is that the king is seated on the throne inside, and the people guard him outside. But the trait of the Holy One, blessed be He, is not the same. His servants take up their seats inside, and He guards them from the outside. As it is said, the Lord is your keeper, the Lord is the shade on your right hand, from Psalm 121.
All right, so the interpretation of Rabbi Hanina ben Hama is that, first of all, recognize that God is so different than a regular person. Normally, if you got a king, the king's on the innermost side of the palace and fortress, and all the guards are stationed outside. But this seems to be implying that the king is the one watching over the rest of us, the commoners, which is a little different than what you'd expect from a flesh and blood king. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, but how is the guarding happening here? It's very easy to jump to the conclusion that the guarding is happening by the magic bubble of protection, like our very first text seemed to be implying. But so far, we seem to be getting this idea that it's not about God shielding in that natural or that supernatural armor way, but there's something else happening. And yes, the metaphors may be misleading, I might argue, if you don't remember the context of where the Ve'ahavta comes from, where the commandment comes from of having this mezuzah. Right? The mezuzah is in the section which talks about reciting them day at home, binding them as a sign upon your hand, and putting them on the gates of your house.
Which are all part of having them upon your heart.
These are all mnemonics, right? These are all methods to aid memory. So the idea that one of those three would somehow provide a magical shield seems a little incongruous. So let's not be surprised then that when we turn to Rambam, that he is going to be very antagonistic to people who have gone down that road to the extreme. So we're at the bottom of the first page.
Okay. But those who write inside the mezuzah the names of angels or holy names or a verse or seals, such people are in the category of those who have no portion in the world to come.
Right, this is the worst form of heresy, is what he's saying.
For these,
Right, but I'm writing additional verses. Like, let's say I wanted to write "The Lord your keeper, the Lord is a shade in your right hand," and I want to write that on the inside of my mezuzah so that it's there as well. Just write that on the scroll, put that inside as well. I mean, could it hurt to add a little more?
or Angel Michael, please protect.
Yeah, a few more mentioning of the angels, a few more mentioning of the verses of God's protection. What's wrong with that?
I'm not supposed to add or deduct from it.
Well, yeah, but can't I embellish? I mean, after all, it's the same idea, right? If the idea is protection, then more verses about protection or more names of protectors, like the angels were thought to be by many, should be all the better, right? I'm just building on a theme.
Right. If a little is good, then more's got to be better.
Right, because I'm building on that theme. However, Rambam is saying not only is that wrong, it is in the furthest category of heresy to do so.
For these idiots, it is not enough for them that they have negated a positive mitzvah by invalidating the mezuzah.
Right, the mezuzah is no longer a kosher mezuzah if you start writing other stuff on it. Right, you don't get to put in your own little private notes on it.
But they have turned an important mitzvah, that is the unification of God's name and the love of God and the worship of God, and made it like it were a magical amulet whose function is to serve their personal needs, as they tend to think in their foolish thoughts that this mezuzah is a thing that affords them benefit in meaningless worldly things.
Well, wait a minute. I mean, isn't he being a little harsh? But isn't that a little harsh? I mean, come on.
No.
What's wrong with?
No.
I love it.
It's because
Yeah.
it can quickly become idolatry.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's so close.
Yes. If you abandon one God. Oh, why not add more gods? You know?
Well, yeah. Why not? Right. So definitely, it is distracting from the unification of God. But if I'm writing other verses that are from God, if I'm writing other verses of God's loving protection over me, right? I'm not inventing new gods. I'm not even treating angels. Let's say I'm leaving angels off of it entirely. I'm just quoting other parts of Tanakh, right? Other verses of the Bible.
But the initial premise is faulty, and we've already
Okay.
told that.
Because then what's happening is
Magical
you thought you knew what the mezuzah was, and then you built on that mistaken assumption, and now you have corrupted it to the point where it's not doing it, and you've totally missed the point of what the mezuzah was meant to do in the first place, which was not to protect you in material ways. Right now, that was probably quite shocking to many people, because as we saw, it was really easy to read some of those other texts as implying that the mezuzah was going to protect me in material ways, right? It was protecting my house. It was protecting my stuff, right? Remember Rav Chanina ben Mezuzah from saying that there was this, you wanted the mezuzah as far the edge of your house as possible to provide the most protection to the house as possible, right? That would be easily misunderstood by someone who had not studied greatly, that the mezuzah was all about shielding. And if it's all about shielding, then any more references to shielding would make sense. And Rambam is saying, which will lead us then to,
In a wonderful world of anti-Semitism, you can retard.
well, in the modern world and even in the historical world, yeah, that putting the mezuzah on your door is a great way to let people know who wouldn't otherwise know a Jew lives here. And unfortunately for some people, that does mean they add you to their target list. All right, but we see from the commentary, this is actually Sforno. I don't know why it got cut off. Sforno trying to tell us again about this do not add, which Yerach was already hinting at. The idea that we do not add or take away from the mitzvot. This particular commentary is on Deuteronomy 4:2.
Do not add. A person should not make the mistake made by King Solomon that he can ignore a prohibition since he knows the reason for the prohibition and can create conditions when such a prohibition would not be justified.
So in particular, King Solomon was famous for later in life for marrying 1,000 women. many of whom were foreign, and most of whom brought their foreign gods with them. Now, King Solomon, according to this commentator, is saying, well, I know why God told me not to marry these people and let them bring their gods. It's so I wouldn't end up worshiping them. But me, Solomon the wise, I'm not going to end up worshiping them. So therefore, it's not a problem and it's good for political alliances, yada, yada, yada. Of course, what happens by the end of Solomon's life? He's gone down the wrong path. Right? So the fact is, we can rationalize to ourselves that this is a good idea. And indeed, with the case of the mezuzah, a lot of people do rationalize. If a mezuzah is good on my house, then the mezuzah is probably good as a necklace. The mezuzah is probably good as a thing I put in my car, right? The car mezuzah, right? I'll take a mezuzah with me if I'm on a plane. And when you do that, you may think that you are embracing the mitzvah even more than God asked. But as a matter of fact, you are denigrating the true reason of the mitzvah and turning it into, as Rambam said, a mere amulet, which is not part of our tradition.
This is reminding me the year we talked about the bronze serpent.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which Hezekiah eventually had to destroy because people had begun worshiping it.
Right.
Okay, so let's find out what are we actually meant to be doing with this mezuzah thing so that we can make this a meaningful and powerful mitzvah as it is meant to be.
It is from the roots of the commandment that it be a memory device for a person about faith in God every time that he comes into his home or he leaves.
You're getting a constant reminder, in and out the door, in and out the door. You're getting the reminder.
And it is like the matter that they, may their memory be blessed, wrote about this commandment. Rabbi Zira said that Rav Mana said that Shmuel said, it is a commandment to place it in the top third. Rabbah said, it is a commandment to place it in the handbreadth adjacent to the public domain. What is the reason? The rabbi said, so that one will be met by the mitzvah immediately.
That sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Right, 2 texts ago, I brought the full version of that. What's the difference between the full version in the Talmud and this abridged version from Sefer HaChinuch? What did he leave out?
It's a memory device.
No, the doorpost length, how high?
Well, no, they talked about they talked about where it needs to be, with the handbreadth to the outer edge.
Tilted.
No. What, from our text to this text. I know there are plenty of other mitzvot details, right? If we go back to the Menachot, right, 33b, right? Rabbi Hanina says so that it will. The rabbi said so that one will meet a mitzvah as soon as one returns home, right? And then what comes next? Rav Hanina of Surah said so that it will afford protection. We turn back to Sefer HaChinuch. Hanina of Surah doesn't get in there, right? The idea that this is coming as protection, even though that was an opinion of a sage, is not included in his summary of the meaning of this mitzvah. Now, that doesn't mean that he is like a greater sage than Rav Hanina of Surah. It means that he, his audience, might misunderstand if he were to also include that, and he really wanted to drive home this message that the mezuzah is not an amulet, that the mezuzah is a memory device. Right? It is there to constantly jog our memory. And he knew that if he kept in the phrase, and it also protects the house, then people would absolutely focus on that. I mean, how many people will avoid something because they think it's bad luck that they wouldn't avoid if it was just their doctor telling them not to do it? Right? If your doctor told you not to eat any more, potato chips, you'd probably ignore him and buy a bag of potato chips on the way home. Right? But if your friend tells you, I heard potato chips are bad luck, you'd probably think twice before you bought the bag of potato chips. And similarly, that is lamentable when it happens for medical or health reasons, but it is even worse spiritually when it happens to mitzvot. When we forget the reason or at least the context of a mitzvah, then we very much run the risk of either diluting or completely distorting what we are meant to gain and benefit from the performance of that mitzvah. All right, so onward. Let's get some more examples of how this is meant to work.
Then, when a person leaves his house, let him pray this short prayer. Master of the universe, please have pity upon me and spare me from the evil impulse and all its minions. Amen. Or else let him recite the first paragraph of the Shema. Hear, Israel, Hashem is our God, Hashem is one, until the verse, You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Then he will be spared that day from all iniquity and guilt.
Ah, wait. Whose iniquity and guilt?
His.
His own. Right? What is the protection the mezuzah is giving you? It is protection against your own failings. Right? It is not there to protect you from some other person's failings. They are unfortunately free agents and able to do what they will. But you are trying to make sure you are doing right. And the mezuzah is there to remind you that you can do right, that you will be able to make it through the day, avoiding all of the worst temptations that might come your way to do things that would be unworthy of you. The mezuzah thus protects you from your own crimes, not from the crimes of others. That's what this memory device is doing. It is helping to protect you from you, which is much more powerful. And also you can probably see why much less desirable, since most people think it's more important to be protected from someone else than being protected from yourself. But you cannot ever be 100% protected from anyone else. The one thing you can be protected from is yourself, because that's the one thing that is in your control, right? It's you are in charge of you. All right, one more from Rambam as he summarizes it in Hilchot Mezuzah.
A person must show great care in the mitzvah of mezuzah, because it is an obligation which is constantly incumbent upon everyone. Whenever a person enters or leaves, he will encounter the unity of the name of the Holy One, blessed be he, and remember his love for him. Thus he will awake from his sleep and his obsession with the vanities of time, and recognize that there is nothing which lasts for eternity except the knowledge of the Creator of the world. This will motivate him to regain full awareness and follow the paths of the upright.
Right, make sure you understand, when he says wake from your sleep, he's not talking about like just getting up in the morning. He's talking about a spiritual sleep where you think all of the stuff that you focus on so much, I need to get more of this, need to do more of that, is so important, is not really so important, especially when you compare it to the eternity of God.
So he'll be woke.
You'll be woke, exactly. And being woke, you will thus be able to avoid most of the problems that you might get into in this life, right? Because all of the issues that might come up that might trigger you to respond badly just won't seem so important anymore when you remember what it was like when you saw the mezuzah and what that meant for you. Whereas if you saw the mezuzah just as a protective amulet, then chances are you are more enmeshed in the material world. You are more looking out for protecting my house, protecting my car, protecting my stuff, protecting this, getting more of my treasures, more of my jewels. Right? Then you are looking at God as being somehow the treasure guard for all of the goodies that you've gotten in this life. And that is precisely the opposite and will lead you further down the road of chasing those goodies, which is usually what will inspire a person to make many mistakes in the hunt for those goodies. So the right idea of the mezuzah is precisely what provides the protection. Onward.
Whoever wears a tefillin on his head and arm, or wears tzitzit on his garment, and has a mezuzah on his entrance, can be assured that he will not sin, because he has many reminders. And these reminders are the true angels who will prevent him from sinning. As Psalm 34 states, the angel of God camps around those who fear him and protects them.
I mean, think for a moment of that idea. It's like, do you want an angel? You don't need an angel, flappy wings angel. You just need reminders so that you won't do wrong. That is the ultimate protection that you can possibly hope for. Now, the problem is, of course, that it is possible to have all of these things, to have tefillin, to have talit, to have a mezuzah, and to so misunderstand them that they no longer do their job, that they no longer are protecting you. In fact, you've now made them as a form of materialism. There's actually a phrase of material spiritualism, of people who collect spiritual acts as though they were collecting cash, and doing it for much the same kind of reasons and with much the same outcome. That is to say, not exactly a fulfilling life. This is meant to break that habit, but they can unfortunately become part of that material world if we forget why it's there. It can become mechanical. Right, exactly. And even worse than that, we can not only do it mechanically of, oh yeah, I have a mezuzah, but when we think about it, we can think about it in 180 degrees the wrong direction. So even when we do think about it consciously, it is only reinforcing the wrong perspective on this world. And that's why we need to make sure that we check our mezuzah. Now, that is one part where I do agree with the first text. The first text said people should check their mezuzah, right? Make sure that the cloth, the scroll inside is kosher, because especially the outdoor mezuzot, they are often subject to weather. I mean, you may have a sealed mezuzah, that's fine. But as you'll see in the last text, we should check it from time to time to make sure that it is indeed still in good shape inside that housing. So let's just get our last text so we get, how often do we need to do this?
A mezuzah belonging to a private house is inspected twice a week, 7 years, and that serving a house belonging to the community twice a jubilee, 50 years.
The community is not as important because it's not an official residence of one person, so it doesn't have one person's responsibility. But for your own mezuzot, for your own house, they should be checked twice in every 7 years. Right? Again, checking doesn't mean replacing. Checking just means you open them up, you check to make sure the scroll is still kosher. And if you have any questions about that, let me know. You put it back in, you put it back on the wall. You're good. And now you're actually thinking about why it's there. You're making sure it's good. You're making sure that you remember what this means. And doing that means that when you walk back and forth, you'll remember it for the right reasons. And that is your protection. Any final questions or comments?
In the back of the mezuzah, the cloth says Shaddai, which stands for Shomer Tot Israel.
That is the acronym that's used. Yes, yes.
So that tells you it's protection, protector of
But protector,
of Tot Israel.
but how is it protecting our doors?
By preventing you from the Yetzer Hara.
Protecting you from doing wrong. Exactly right. It's protecting you from doing wrong. It's not protecting wrong from being done to you. And that's what we got to make sure we keep in our mind. And if we walk through the day, each one of us saying, today I will focus on making sure I do nothing wrong. Well, if we're all doing that, then guess what? No wrong will be done to you either. Because if everyone around you is holding themselves back from doing wrong, then who's going to hurt you? Right? If you don't hurt them and they don't hurt you, wow, we just made it through the day without causing any trouble. It's that easy, but you have to start with yourself first.
Yeah.